Coming up on this award-winning and globally acclaimed monument to investigative muckraking, can we actually produce sufficient electricity to facilitate the transition to full EVs? Is Electric Utopia even possible on this basis? The answer might just shock you. See what I did there? I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, new cars cheap but Australia only website. Card! Today's report, question and answer session, whatever, is inspired by an dude named Nick and sponsored by me. So if you've got rooftop solar and you want to make it even more effective from a climate action point of view, even less dependent on coal in the evening when the sun goes bye-bye, then you could fit a battery, and you could go to autoexpert.com.au/solar for more on that. The battery I've got in mind is modular, so you can start small and add capacity later on if you find you need more. It's really well thought out, fraction of the size of an EV battery, safer, more stable, doesn't have to discharge as fast and hard to do its thing, and just generally less of a drain on the Earth's resources, while still allowing you to suck in photons during the day and incinerate them as electrons in the evening, and be even less dependent on those bastards who run the grid. So there's that. autoexpert.com.au/solar for more on that if it is of interest. Now, let's get into Nick's question, or should I say questions. And I have to say that Nick has a hell problem in Australia. He's got too big a brain, clearly. And this is really the recipe not to fit in. Like, dude, I can sympathise. If you are solving differential equations during the day at university, and then next week you walk into a welding bay, or heaven forbid, in the evening, into some martial arts dojo, let us not be talking about Maxwell's equations. Incidentally, if God did turn the lights on, this is what she had to say to get them running. So there's that. But let us not discuss that with the dudes that you find in ordinary places, down the pub, the welding bay, the dojo, whatever. Instead, I'd be discussing, I don't know, have you seen the new Ranger Wild track? That thing is the tits. Dude, when I finish my apprenticeship, that's what I'm getting. Just roll like that for a bit and you'll fit right in. Nick goes, I just listened to a conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson on his popular YouTube channel Star Talk about EVs and how they are better for the environment than ICE vehicles, and that carbon scrubbing technology can prevent the impact of fossil fuel burning. Everything's more complex than it seems, and I'd suggest that lower emissions and better for the environment are different things, and there's nuance in everything. So there's that. It's easy to overlook the terrible environmental cost of lithium, cobalt, nickel production, all of which you need for batteries, obviously, and there's a huge drain there, as well as social cost in parts of the world. This carbon scrubbing technology doesn't really exist at the kind of scale we would need it to exist at to reduce the proportion of CO2 in the atmosphere. The only place where carbon scrubbing technology, like CO2 scrubbers, are actually deployed effectively are submarines and the space station, manned space flight generally. The Apollo spacecraft had carbon scrubbing technology in the atmosphere management, life support thingo, because otherwise you die, because carbon dioxide is a deadly poison when the concentration gets over, don't quote me, but like 12% or something. The atmosphere can be knee-deep in oxygen, so it's not suffocating you, right? It's poisoning you when the concentration gets too high, so they use lithium hydroxide to scrub it out. They also use it in the sort of special ops scuba apparatus, the things they call rebreathers. So you suck in a bit of air from your rebreather, You breathe it out, you're underwater, you're putting a mine on some enemy warship or something. You don't want the bubbles to rise up and give the sailors on watch the alert that you're down there, because they might just start dropping grenades or something into the water. So the rebreather means that you exhale back into the system. It goes through a lithium hydroxide scrubber, and that takes the CO2 out, and therefore the concentration can't elevate to the extent that it kills you. But we can't do that at a planetary scale, obviously, because that would be ridiculous. So every other attempt to capture and store CO2 and stop it getting out into the atmosphere is $1 billion fail. So if we're going to rely on that, even if NGDT says it's possible, theoretically, yeah, I guess it's possible, but get back to me when it works. So there's that. The takeaway from the discussion seemed to be that a transition to EVs is a viable solution to dirty internal combustion engine pollution, and that we should all go and buy EVs. Apparently the answer is yes, our infrastructure can handle an all-electric world. Who knew? I wonder how scalable the idea of EVs actually is. What about the necessary infrastructure for all those EV charging stations and the grid? I also wonder how people without a garage charging setup are going to charge their EVs, and how the grid can supply the necessary electricity to everyone. Excellent questions, Nick, and this is the curse of having a big brain. You wonder about the how of implementation. You just don't get on the superhighway to Electric Utopia and go, net zero shit, yeah. You go, how are we going to make that work? Is it even possible? And I suggest that this is what the technologically literate have been doing for centuries, and it's what essentially has turned the 12th century into the modern world. So questions of this nature, approved, dude, and I will do my best to give you a sort of big picture answer of all of this. And I've made some notes, so do excuse me for referring to them. Now, on fundamentals here in Australia, we drive about 210 billion, with a B, kilometres every year. That's just literally how we roll. This is a vast distance, okay? It's like more than 30 return trips to Pluto. Why you'd bother going back, like holiday destinations, a bit of a fail. Not even a freaking planet anymore, is it? So the average EV consumes about 17 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres of driving. That's from the Electric Vehicle Council, which is a lobby group designed to make EVs look good. So we'll take their number because it's the most complimentary interpretation, probably more like 20 to 25. Now, when you crunch the numbers on that, you just need the distance and the amount of electrical energy per 100 kilometres, like total driving distance, and the amount of electricity consumption per unit driving distance, and you can work out how much electricity we need. And what we need is another 35,700 gigawatt hours of electricity to do all of that driving in EVs. And this is a ballpark number, so we'd just say, I don't know, 40,000 gigawatt hours kind of thing seems reasonable, right? And that's like a lot of electricity. If you leave the lights on for a few centuries, the bill is going to be, hard to jump over and of that nature. But we currently generate about 275,000 gigawatt hours of electricity in Australia. So another 40,000 isn't a ridiculous idea, right? Because we're already producing nearly 300,000 gigawatt hours. We only need another 40 kind of thing. So that would be to run an all-electric fleet to do all of the driving done in the entire nation, even all of the heavy freight and the vehicles that don't exist yet in the EV domain to do that. If we magic them up, we just have to do a bit more generating to power all those EVs. So from a electricity creation, generation point of view, not that hard. But obviously you'd want to do it with renewables, wouldn't you? And currently only about 90 of the 275 is renewable. And if you wanted to increase the renewable generation capacity to power this hypothetical immediate transition to full EVs, you'd need to add another 40,000 of renewables to the 90,000 that we already produce. So that's roughly a 50% hike in renewables just to power an entire fleet of EVs, which is also not a ridiculous thing because it's going to take decades upon decades to transition fully to EVs for driving in Australia because we've got 15 million vehicles, light vehicles on the road. And even if we sold, 500,000 EVs a year in Australia, in 10 years, that's 5 million, right? And we've got 15 million to replace. So it's more than a 30-year proposition at that kind of replacement rate. And 500,000 is roughly 1 in 2 vehicles sold in Australia. So it's going to take a long time. Generating the electricity, not a problem, but charging them on coal would be dead easy. And let's face it, most people who buy an EV end up charging it a lot on coal because they drive home and they plug in and they charge up overnight. They work during the day, they come home, they plug in. They're running it on coal, and that kind of upends the net zero fantasy ever so slightly because you're running the car on coal, and that's about as filthy as driving a diesel dual cab ute when you crunch the numbers on the grid composition today. But obviously renewables will increase and there'll be more renewable energy in the grid, and this will incrementally decline. The coal component of charging an EV overnight will incrementally decline, right? But it's not changing dramatically anytime soon. So distributing it to the actual chargers is the problem, right? And by that, I mean, we are going to have filling stations, not unlike our current petrol stations, but they're going to have to be DC high power fast chargers to facilitate the needs of everybody who doesn't have off-street parking. And this is mainly a feature of living in the city. There's so many people who don't do that. You can't just drop an extension cord out of a 10th floor balcony, although I did read a story about a dude who did that the other day just to charge up their car. It's just unworkable, like extension cords in the rain overnight. It's just amateur hour. We've got to come up with a robust way of doing that. And if you think about a servo in the future, which is instead of petrol bowsers, there are electricity bowsers, and they're 200 kilowatts apiece, and there's 16 of them, right? So this would allow you to charge up your average EV in like 15 minutes. At 200 kilowatts, you'd be putting 50 kilowatt hours of electricity into an EV in a quarter of an hour. Now, this is still a hell of a long time to just sit there fondling your scrotum, isn't it? Where you could be in and out in 3 minutes in liquid hydrocarbon territory. But it's going to require 3.2 megawatts of electricity supply capacity, because if you're going to build 16 pumps, if you like, you have to assume that they're going to be fully utilised at some time. And if you don't want to throttle back the charge rate of all of them when that takes place, you have to have the electricity capacity to supply the 3.2 megawatts of electricity. And that's kind of a problem. Let's just think about that for a moment. 3.2 megawatts is roughly the same as 300 conventional domestic houses running absolutely flat out, which is also impossible because if you got 300 houses in your street and adjoining streets and max them out, okay, at the whatever it is, 11-ish kilowatts that each house can hypothetically draw, you blow something in the substation for sure, because the assumption is that all houses don't do that at once, right? The supply capacity is not there, but each house is kind of rated for 230 volts at 50 amps maximum. And that hypothetical filling station, that's that, okay? It only with EV charging, and the capacity is ridiculous. Building it into the poles and wires and the local supply infrastructure is a massive technical challenge that nobody is talking about with the future deployment of EVs and this superhighway to Electric Utopia. Draw me the diagram in red lipstick on the back of the napkin, dude, because I'm just not seeing it. Despite Neil deGrasse Tyson's view, I wonder how this transition to electric vehicles is even possible, given the volume of resources required to construct enough EVs to replace all the internal combustion ones. That's a pretty good point also, and I'm not a mining engineer, right? I'm a mechanical engineer. So I can tell you that just replacing 15 million vehicles is kind of a big job. That's the number of light vehicles on Australian roads, and it's impossible to conceptualise. So think about it like this. If each one of those vehicles averages 4 metres long, and we park them all bumper to bumper in a thought experiment in our heads, 4 metres times 15 million is 60 million metres, right? And you think, 60 million metres, that's like saying there's 60 million stars in the sky. You go, yeah. It's like this, 60 million metres is 60,000 kilometres, conga line. So if you wanted to fit those vehicles in Australia, you need to build a 15-lane highway stretching from Sydney to Perth, and then it would be perfectly gridlocked with those vehicles. And that's the number that you have to replace. So I would argue that that is a shit ton of petrochemical plastics and steel and glass and aluminium and all the other components that go in conventional cars. Tyres, right? It's 60 million tyres plus the spares, even though EVs don't have them typically. And then it's the batteries with all of their specialist mineral componentry, right? And I can't tell you how available that is, but I can tell you that there was a conference held by Benchmark Mineral Intelligence in Australia, and it was called the Gigafactories Asia Pacific Conference. It was held in September of 2022. And during that conference, a woman named Sinead Kaufman, who is the boss of lithium production for Rio Tinto, which is one of the biggest mining companies in the world, stood up in front of her colleagues and reporters and said, and this is a long quote, but it's kind of important if you want to think about building a 15-lane superhighway of gridlock to Electric Utopia just discussed. Here's the quote from Ms. Kaufman. She says, "Battery Materials in Rio has been really dedicated to trying to build at scale a portfolio of mining assets across lithium, but also other critical minerals and battery materials. And we see, as others do, an enormous demand for lithium as a building stock for lithium-ion batteries." Like, oh, duh. I mean, forecasts show that light electric vehicles will make up about 50% of the light vehicles on the road by 2030, which means that lithium consumption needs to surge way above anything that's currently been planned to be mined. With every project in the world that's projected to come on, we'll still be short by 50% of the amount of lithium that's required to build the electric vehicles. Now, I can tell you as somebody who's been something of a investigative shit stirrer for quite a few decades now, every time somebody in a particular position opens their gob and their lips start flapping and air comes out, you have to at least pay homage to the probability that they might have a vested interest and they might be lying to you because it might serve their vested interest. Bullshitting is probably a kinder way to describe that. Now, I've carved that statement up 3,000 different ways, and I can't think of a reason for Ms. Kaufman to be bullshitting on that, because she's in the business of exploiting minerals and selling them. And if demand is way outstripping supply like that, it means there's an absolute bonanza for all lithium producers over the next few decades. And if the shortfall is going to be that profound, no amount of bullshit can pump up the profitability of the organisation, because the fundamental economics says it's already a gold rush, right? So where's the other 50% of the lithium coming from? You can't just dig a hole, you can't Jed clamp at it. You can't dig up a hole and get the Texas tea and just move to Beverly Hills. It doesn't work that way with something as environmentally reprehensible as a lithium mine. It takes decades to get something like that approved with all of the environmental controls, and it's not a straightforward extraction or production process. So this is a real problem logistically, and nobody in the National Monument to the Death of Integrity in Public Life, also called Parliament House, Canberra, nobody's talking about that. Where the fuck is the lithium going to come from to make the single most important, expensive, whatever component in all of these magical EVs that will chauffeur us to Electric Utopia? So there's that. I also wonder about the life cycle of the batteries and what happens to them when they are dead. Also, an issue that nobody in the Monument to the Death of Integrity is talking about. There's no custody, right? There's no chain of responsibility imposed on the manufacturer or the owner of the battery, right? We're told that batteries can be recycled. This is like plastic can be recycled. It doesn't mean it is recycled. It means it could hypothetically be recycled. If it's not economically viable to do so, though, these batteries are just going to sit somewhere. They're going to sit in shipping containers, in storage facilities, in back paddocks of whatever sort of salvage yards. There's no legislation that compels anyone to treat with respect the materials in the battery. And A, that's terrible for the environment because it means virgin materials have to be exploited. And B, it's terrible for the environment because the materials are so highly freaking toxic. Lithium hexafluorophosphate in the drinking water is Erin Brockovich rebooted, basically. I wonder about a great many things. Are natural boobies better than silicon ones? You're just being a little silly now, Nick, aren't you? And we can both see this, but I would suggest that obviously this is A, epistemically subjective, so it kind of depends on you, and B, it's best determined on a case-by-case basis with, obviously enough, appropriate consent. If you clean your vacuum cleaner, does this mean you become a vacuum cleaner? Yes, Nick, it does, dude. And obviously, if this happens to you, it sucks. Do we even have free will, or is everything determined? How is this even vaguely related to EVs, Nick? Like, come on, back on track, son. But free will is mostly an illusion. You should listen to what Sam Harris has to say on that. It's absolutely fascinating. Now, you didn't have any choice in writing me these ridiculous questions, and I didn't have any choice in answering them. Everything is determined like that. Like, I don't want anyone to think that I chose to live my life in this way and end up here when I could have been, I don't know, a billionaire playboy with a fascination for the letter X. I double dead dingo donga dare you to debunk what the great Neil deGrasse Tyson has to say. I smell the distinctive scent of regular viewer here, Nick. Now, NDGT is somebody I obviously respect and admire. He says what he really thinks. He's got runs on the board, but I think he first qualified as a physicist, like he's got a degree in physics, and then I think he became an astronomer or an astrophysicist or something like that. And to me, as somebody who applies physics, and, you know, the shit that engineers do is like physics in the ghetto. It's like BJJ physics. It has to work at the end of the day. And all this other stuff, you know, theoretical physics and astronomy and things of that nature, they're all a little bit airy-fairy. They don't have to make anything work. So I'd suggest that let's take a rock star engineer, for example, the Igor Sikorsky, the inventor of the helicopter, like, ladies and gentlemen, small round of applause, overcoming all of those problems, like getting one of those freaking things into the air reliably and safely. Not everyone could do that. And I'd suggest that there's an element of this kind of disconnection in many of the non-astrophysics things in which people like astrophysicists comment on, because they're predisposed to saying, oh, well, just scrub that CO2 out of the air. How hard can it be? And the answer is, hypothetically, no problem, dude, but when you've got to actually do it and build a machine or a set of big whatevers around the world that just continuously sucks and blows, and the blowing is with less CO2, obviously then the answer is it's very freaking hard, and currently we're not capable of doing that. So there's a disconnection like that. Theoretically, like, lots of things are possible. Fusion is possible, full self-driving is possible, that's fine. Actually doing it, not so much. On a more serious note, I can't help but think that a better idea would be for us to change our behaviour rather than to construct new technology to use as an excuse so we can continue to do what we like without accepting reality. Yes, I couldn't agree more. The way we are allowing various vested interest groups, such as the car industry and senior politicians, to railroad us into this fantasy concept of net zero and electric utopia is ridiculous and absurd. Like, here's the proposition: save the planet by buying 2 tons of precious materials at $100,000 a throw. Like, okay, could we not perhaps just come up with, I don't know, a series of better options, such as just pulling one out of my arse, which nobody in politics in Australia ever talks about? Why don't we just build better public transport in our cities so that people aren't motivated to get in their cars? Because frankly, going from the outer suburbs to the city and back every day on our roads is shit. That's not driving. That's wasting your fucking life in a car. And if public transport were free and not shit, people would use it, would they not? Nobody enjoys paying the extortionate tolls that we pay, in particular here in the knee of Sid, for example. And how profound is this problem, and how good would it be if we had non-shit public transport? I'd say very profound and very good if our mass transit were non-shit. We could start with non-shit and then build it up to excellent at a far cheaper cost to the community than rolling out this ridiculous Electric Utopia EV charging infrastructure that will be needed if this is the road we are in fact on. I can only hope that this falls over for physical type concrete reasons, like problems that can't be overcome with even more bullshit out of Parliament House, right? So there's a Climate Council report which was released yesterday or the day before, and it's called Next Stop Suburbia. Now, I don't always agree with the Climate Council, but it's very hard to disagree with them on much of this one. They found that more than 7 million Australians, which is more than a quarter of the population, so more than 7 million Australians living in our 5 biggest cities, don't have access to the kind of public transport system that would motivate them to get in it as an alternative to the car, okay? And that meant being less than 15 minutes walk away kind of thing and running every 15 minutes. It was something like that in the report. Don't hold my feet to the fire on that, but it seemed entirely reasonable. Now, building in better public transport is much simpler than transitioning, I hate that word, to electric utopia, because we already have trains and we already have buses and things of this nature. We just need to make them better, to implement them better. And here's the thing about what difference will this make. If you want to transition to EVs, it's going to take decades. It's going to take like half a century, because even if we sell 1 million EVs a year, it's a 15-year proposition. And some of those EVs will wear out and need to be replaced, and some combustion cars will still be on the road. So it's going to be like 20 years if we sell 1 million a year, and we can't do that because we'd never get them, and people wouldn't buy them because some people want a dual cab ute to drive across the Simpson Desert, and you can't do that currently with an EV. The vehicles to do this job are not available. I just had a delivery. I had to stop in the middle of this session to pick up a delivery from DHL. Dude walks up the driveway. I go, "Oh, thanks, mate." And he goes, "No workers." And he's in a diesel van. And if he were in an electric van doing the same job, he'd be half as productive on a daily basis at best. So there's that, okay? Now, if you put extra buses on the road, right, and you make them not shit, you give them their own dedicated lanes and they fast track it and they leapfrog all those bastards stuck in cars, for example, every bus is 30 to 50 cars that are off the road, because when you drive in peak hour traffic, there's one person in a 1.5 to 2 ton steel shell, right? It's the least efficient system for getting thousands of people from their A's to the one central B and then back again in Vicky Verkerland at 5 p.m. when the plant whistle fucking blows, right? If you put one extra train in service and it's utilised during the peak, that's like 1,200 cars that are no longer on the road gumming up the works. So the benefits here would be twofold, right? Congestion for the people who need to drive would be greatly reduced. Emissions would be greatly reduced as well, because when you think of a bus, if you put 40 people on a bus as an alternative to driving 40 cars on the same trip, the bus doesn't burn 40 times the amount of fuel as the cars would. You know, like as one car. You need 40 cars, but you're not burning 40 times the fuel of one car if you put those 40 people in a bus. It's like payload efficiency, right? The same thing with trains. If you put 1,200 people on a train, sure, you've got to burn a bit of coal to power the train, but hey, it's not 1,200 cars worth of CO2 for the same journey, right? And those people can even be productive when they're there because they get out their tablet or their laptop and they get their emails up to date. And, you know, the boss is essentially getting an extra hour or two of productivity out of whomever, especially if they're diligent and want to do their job and they're otherwise highly motivated. And you don't arrive at the office like you want to kill someone because of the absolute aggro that pertains and the demand on your cognitive resources just driving in peak hour traffic. It's not fun. You feel wasted when you get to the office at 8:30, and then you feel wasted when you get home at, 6:30, 7 p.m. at night because you've had to endure 2 hours of wasting your fucking life in traffic. And nobody ever talks about this in politics. It's like the world's best productivity, environment, efficiency, free kick. And yet mass transit, efficient mass transit always goes under the bus. I just don't get it. I love your channel and greatly appreciate your honesty, your humour and your scrutiny of bullshit. Make Australia less shit. Absolutely. Make Australia less shit. It's the best we can aspire to at this point, I feel, because the joint is shit. We need to make it less shit. We can't aspire to excellence without a couple of decades at least of incrementally less shit, year on year on year. This is how to do it. Clearly, when I'm your next Prime Minister, this is the first bill I will pass in Parliament, the Make Australia Less Shit bill. Everyone would, I'd get bipartisan support. Even the Teals would go for that. So on this issue of I appreciate your honesty, your humour and your scrutiny of bullshit, like, dude, get your hand off my buttocks at this late stage of our interaction. I've already answered your question. No need to butter me up. I've already put out for you, and now I'm not in the mood.